The snow fell with that particular English determination that transforms the countryside into a Christmas card, and it was on such an evening, Christmas Eve to be precise, that I found myself once more in the comfortable embrace of a country house party, where the warmth of polished oak and the gentle murmur of well-bred conversation provided a most agreeable refuge from the elements outside. Thornfield Abbey had been in the Blackwood family for generations, a rambling Tudor edifice with Norman foundations and Georgian additions that somehow managed to present a harmonious whole. Lady Penelope Blackwood, our hostess, possessed that particular English talent for making a house feel both grand and welcoming. Holly and ivy adorned the ancient stone walls with practiced elegance, while great bowls of winter roses lent their fragrance to complement the pine boughs that decorated every mantelpiece. The great hall boasted a magnificent fir tree, its branches heavy with silver ornaments and real beeswax candles that cast a warm, golden glow throughout the room. It was precisely at the stroke of midnight, that mystical threshold between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, when the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by a cry that would haunt my memory for years to come. Lady Penelope's voice, usually so modulated and refined, tore through the festive air with a raw terror that froze the blood of every guest present. We found Sir Alistair Blackwood, Lady Penelope's distinguished brother and master of Thornfield Abbey, in his private study, that sanctum sanctorum where he conducted his affairs and retreated from the world. He lay crumpled beside his massive mahogany desk, his evening clothes disheveled, his usually florid complexion now bearing the waxy pallor of death. Dr. Whitmore, who had been among our party and rushed immediately to examine him, confirmed what we all feared. Sir Alistair was beyond mortal aid. But it was not merely the fact of his death that sent a collective shiver through our assembled company. It was the impossible circumstances surrounding it. The study door had been locked from within, the key still clutched in Sir Alistair's lifeless hand. The windows, those heavy Tudor casements with their diamond-paned glass, remained latched securely from the inside, undisturbed by the winter storm that raged beyond. Not a pane was cracked, not a latch forced, yet there Sir Alistair lay, as dead as any man could be. Most peculiar of all was the single beeswax candle that stood upon his desk, burning with an unwavering flame despite the late hour and the chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the ancient building. This solitary light continued to burn with an almost defiant brightness, casting dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes and scattered papers, as if refusing to acknowledge the darkness that had descended upon Thornfield Abbey. The assembled guests, a carefully selected group of family and close associates, stood in the hallway outside the locked study, each face a study in shock and dawning suspicion. There was Miss Victoria Crane, Sir Alistair's efficient secretary, her usual composure cracked like thin ice. Beside her stood Mr. Edmund Thornfield, Sir Alistair's nephew and heir presumptive, whose arrival that very evening after years of bitter estrangement now seemed ominously fortuitous. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood, a distant cousin, clutched his prayer book with trembling hands, while Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had served the family for 3 decades, wept silently into her handkerchief. Sir Reginald Ashworth, Sir Alistair's business partner and long-time friend, took charge with the authority of one accustomed to command. "We must telephone the police immediately," he declared, though his voice betrayed an uncertainty that his words attempted to mask. "Though I fear this storm may prevent them from reaching us tonight." Indeed, fate seemed determined to trap us within these ancient walls. The telephone lines had been severed by falling branches, and the roads were impassable under several feet of fresh snow. Thornfield Abbey had become an island unto itself, populated by the living and the dead, with secrets that demanded unveiling. It was at this moment of helpless isolation that Providence, in her infinite wisdom, provided an unexpected solution. Through the howling wind came the unmistakable sound of an automobile engine struggling against the elements, followed by the crunch of footsteps upon snow. The great front door opened with a blast of frigid air, and into our scene of death and bewilderment stepped a small, immaculately dressed gentleman whose egg-shaped head and magnificent moustache marked him as distinctly foreign. "Mes excuses," the stranger announced in precise, accented English, brushing snow from his pristine overcoat with fastidious care. "I am Hercule Poirot, and I fear that my motorcar has become quite hopelessly stuck in your drive. I had hoped to seek shelter until—" His words ceased abruptly as his remarkably keen eyes took in the scene before him, noting every detail from our expressions of shock to the locked door behind which death waited. "Mon Dieu," he murmured softly, removing his hat with practiced precision and smoothing his mustache with one gloved finger. "It appears that Poirot has arrived not merely as a refugee from the storm, but perhaps as an instrument of justice itself." The little Belgian detective stepped further into the hall, his sharp gaze already cataloguing every face, every gesture, every telling detail with the methodical precision of a master craftsman examining his tools. He paused before the locked study door, his head tilted slightly as if listening to secrets that only he could hear. "A locked room," he observed quietly, his voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. "And a candle that burns when all else has been extinguished. How very intriguing." His eyes, bright with intelligence and an almost childlike curiosity, swept over our assembled group. "Ladies and gentlemen, it would appear that we have before us a most fascinating puzzle, and Hercule Poirot, he does so enjoy a good puzzle." The game, as they say, was afoot, and though we could not have known it then, we were about to witness the methodical unraveling of one of the most ingenious crimes ever committed within the walls of an English country house, a crime that would test even the remarkable deductive powers of the world's greatest detective. The pale winter light of Christmas morning revealed the full extent of our predicament. Snow continued to fall in thick, determined flakes, adding to the already formidable barriers that sealed Thornfield Abbey from the outside world. The telephone lines remained severed, and the roads had become impassable chasms of white. We were truly marooned with death as our unwelcome guest. Hercule Poirot had risen early, declining breakfast in favor of what he termed the sustenance of observation. I watched through frost-etched windows as his small figure made a careful circuit of the Abbey's exterior, his sharp eyes examining every window, every possible point of entry or exit. When he returned, his cheeks pink with cold but his eyes bright with purpose, he accepted Lady Penelope's offer of coffee with courtly grace. "Before we proceed," Poirot announced, settling into a wing-back chair near the fire, "it becomes necessary to examine the scene of this tragedy most carefully. The locked room she presents us with a puzzle of considerable complexity." With Lady Penelope's permission, we accompanied the little detective to Sir Alister's study. The door, its lock now broken by Sir Reginald's earlier efforts, revealed the scene in all its mysterious detail. Sir Alister lay where he had fallen, the key still clutched in his stiffened hand. Most remarkable was the single beeswax candle upon his desk, burning with that same unwavering flame, its light casting dancing shadows across scattered papers and leather-bound volumes. Poirot approached the desk with the reverence of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The candlestick bore a thin ring of cooled wax along one side. "It burned, then the wax ceased to flow," he murmured, his fingers hovering over but not touching the evidence. "Yet it continues to burn. Most curious." An open diary lay beside the candle, its final entry written in Sir Alister's bold hand. 11:40 p.m. Ashworth, final decision reached. The windows remained securely latched from within, their diamond panes undisturbed save for a small smear on the rightmost catch. The fireplace held only cold ashes, and the air carried a faint medicinal sweetness that might have been peppermint or aniseed. "Dr. Whitmore," Poirot said quietly. "Your professional opinion, if you please." The country physician, his weathered face grave, cleared his throat. "I'm afraid there can be no doubt, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Alistair was poisoned. The symptoms are unmistakable, though I cannot determine the specific agent without proper laboratory facilities." The word poisoned fell among our assembled company like a thunderclap. Miss Victoria Crane gasped audibly, her usually steady hands trembling as she clutched her spectacles. Edmund Thornfield's face darkened with what might have been shock or calculation. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood gripped his prayer book as if it were a lifeline, while Mrs. Pemberton renewed her quiet weeping. "Poison," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that explains the manner of death, but it does not explain the impossible circumstances, does it? How does poison reach a man locked alone in his study?" "Perhaps," I ventured, "the poison was administered earlier, and Sir Alistair simply succumbed while alone." "An excellent theory, mon ami, but for one small detail." Poirot gestured toward the candle. "Mrs. Pemberton, you mentioned yesterday that you personally extinguished all candles before retiring. Did this include Sir Alistair's study?" The elderly housekeeper nodded emphatically. "Oh, yes, sir. The master was most particular about fire safety. I always checked his study last, just after 11 o'clock. I distinctly remember snuffing out 3 candles on his desk." 3 candles, Poirot mused. "Yet we find only one burning, and this one burns still, though by all natural law it should have guttered hours ago." His keen gaze swept over our faces, cataloguing every expression, every nervous gesture. "It would seem, mes amis, that we face not merely murder, but a murderer of considerable ingenuity. One who has created what appears to be an impossible crime." He straightened, his manner becoming brisk and businesslike. "Very well. We shall proceed methodically. Each person will account for their movements between 11:30 and midnight. We shall examine every detail, every contradiction, until the truth emerges. For truth, like that stubborn candle, has a way of refusing to be extinguished." The investigation had begun in earnest. The morning room at Thornfield Abbey provided an ideal setting for Poirot's methodical interviews. Winter sunlight streamed through tall mullioned windows, casting geometric patterns across Persian carpets, while a coal fire fought valiantly against the persistent chill. Poirot arranged 3 chairs with mathematical precision, one for himself behind Lady Penelope's writing desk, one for each interviewee, and a third where I might observe what he termed the fascinating interplay of truth and deception. "My friends," Poirot announced to our assembled company, his voice carrying that particular gentleness that somehow made confession seem inevitable. "It is not my intention to accuse, merely to understand. We shall proceed with order and method, for chaos serves only the guilty." Miss Victoria Crane was summoned first. Sir Alistair's secretary possessed that particular efficiency common to unmarried women who have devoted themselves entirely to their profession. Her steel-grey hair was pulled back severely. Her dark dress bore no ornamentation save a simple cameo brooch, and she clutched a leather-bound notebook as if it were both shield and weapon. "You have served Sir Alistair for how long, mademoiselle?" Poirot inquired, his hands folded precisely before him. 15 years, Monsieur Poirot. I began as a junior clerk and worked my way to my current position." Her voice carried unmistakable pride despite the circumstances. "I was perhaps the only person, apart from Mrs. Pemberton, who entered Sir Alistair's study regularly. And yesterday evening after dinner, you visited the study." "Yes, at approximately 10:15. Sir Alistair had requested certain documents regarding the family trust." Miss Crane's composure flickered momentarily. He seemed troubled, more so than usual. There had been irregularities in some accounts, and he'd discovered certain discrepancies that concerned him greatly. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Discrepancies of what nature?" "I cannot say precisely. Sir Alistair was most secretive about such matters. but he did mention that Mr. Edmund's inheritance was contingent upon certain clauses being satisfied. Her gaze flickered away when Poirot asked about her movements between 11:30 and midnight. I was in the library, then my room preparing for bed. I carry peppermint pastilles for my throat. The winter air affects me so. Edmund Thornfield presented a stark contrast when he slouched into the interview chair. Tall and lean, with the predatory handsomeness of a man accustomed to living by his wits, his evening clothes showed signs of careful maintenance rather than recent purchase. "You arrived yesterday evening after an absence of—" "How long?" Poirot asked. 5 years, Edmund replied, his voice carefully modulated. Uncle Alistair and I had what you might call philosophical differences regarding my chosen lifestyle. "Ah, the lifestyle of a gentleman of leisure, perhaps?" Edmund's smile held no warmth. Uncle Alistair disapproved of my investments in various enterprises. Horse racing, cards, that sort of thing. Yet 3 weeks ago, he wrote suggesting that family bonds should transcend temporary disagreements. He hinted at changes to his will. "And did you discuss these changes?" "Briefly, after dinner. He asked me to meet him in his study, but our conversation was cryptic. He seemed to enjoy keeping me in suspense about my future prospects." Edmund's fingers drummed against his knee. "I left through the French doors to the terrace. Uncle preferred that exit for private meetings." "In a snowstorm? How very considerate of your uncle's privacy." Sir Reginald Ashworth commanded attention even in grief. His military bearing and weathered complexion spoke of a man accustomed to command, though his partnership with Sir Alistair had spanned 2 decades of civilian enterprise. "Alistair summoned me to discuss a rather delicate business matter," Sir Reginald explained, his voice heavy with controlled emotion. "We were finalizing our response to certain irregularities in our London office. Someone had been systematically embezzling funds over several months. And Sir Alistair suspected whom. He had his theories. The final decision he mentioned in his diary concerned our course of action." Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. A considerable sum was involved, nearly £10,000. We were to confront the culprit this morning. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood proved a study in nervous energy, his thin hands constantly adjusting his clerical collar. As a distant cousin dependent upon Sir Alistair's charity, he occupied that uncomfortable position between family and employee. "I spent the evening in the library, reading and preparing my Christmas sermon," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Around 11:30, I heard voices from the study. Sir Alistair and another man. The tone seemed heated. I carry aniseed lozenges for my cough, nothing more." Mrs. Pemberton, summoned last, wept throughout her interview. "The master seemed troubled these past weeks," she sobbed, "staying up late, pacing his study. Yesterday he asked such strange questions about household routines, about who possessed keys to various rooms. When I made my rounds at 11, I extinguished 3 candles on his desk and noticed a smear of lavender wax on the window catch. I polished it clean, as always." When the interviews concluded, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him. Each conversation had revealed new layers of complexity. Financial irregularities, inheritance disputes, family secrets, and alibis that seemed both plausible and suspiciously convenient. "The candle, mes amis," he said finally, his voice soft but penetrating. "When Sir Alistair was last seen alive, 1 candle burned. When Madame Pemberton made her rounds, 3 were extinguished. At midnight, 1 burned with stubborn constancy." His keen gaze swept over the assembled faces. "A flame can be taught to behave like a servant, or to mislead like a clever advocate. Human beings, they arrange appearances to suit their hopes and fears." He rose, smoothing his mustache with characteristic precision. "We have alibis, motives, and contradictions in abundance. But the locked room remains locked, the impossible remains impossible, and somewhere in these testimonies lies a thread that, when pulled, will unravel the entire tapestry of deception. The investigation was gathering momentum, and I could see in Poirot's bright, speculative eyes that his remarkable mind was already beginning to perceive patterns invisible to the rest of us. The afternoon light filtering through Thornfield Abbey's ancient windows cast long shadows across Sir Alister's study as Poirot conducted his most thorough examination yet. The mysterious candle had finally succumbed to natural law and guttered out, leaving behind a pool of hardened wax and the lingering question of its impossible endurance. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot said, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "This candle tells us a most fascinating story." He examined the base of the candlestick with methodical precision. "The wax she has pooled in a perfect circle, suggesting no movement, no disturbance. Yet a candle of this size, burning naturally for 12 hours, should have consumed itself entirely." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with professional interest. "You suspect some form of chemical treatment?" "Perhaps. But first, let us examine what Madame Pemberton discovered upon the window catch." Poirot moved to the diamond-paned casement, his glass revealing minute traces of purple-tinted wax within the metal hinges. Lavender wax, as she described. Most curious, since Sir Alister used only plain beeswax candles in his study. Miss Crane entered at that moment, carrying a small brass key. "Monsieur Poirot, I've brought the key to Sir Alister's private filing cabinet. I thought you should examine its contents before—" She paused, noting our intent examination of the window. "Is something amiss?" "On the contrary, mademoiselle, everything is precisely as someone intended it to appear." Poirot accepted the key with courtly grace, though appearances, as we shall discover, can be most deceptive. The filing cabinet revealed decades of meticulous record-keeping, but it was a folder marked "Confidential Investigations" that captured Poirot's immediate attention. The documents within detailed systematic embezzlement from Blackwood Ashworth Enterprises. Nearly £10,000 over 18 months, taken by someone with intimate knowledge of the company's procedures. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, studying the detective agency's final report. Sir Alister had identified his thief. The final decision mentioned in his diary was whether to prosecute or handle the matter privately. Sir Reginald appeared in the doorway, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the weight of recent events. "I see you've discovered Alister's investigation. We were to confront the culprit this morning, a most distressing business involving someone we both trusted implicitly. And this someone, they were present at Thornfield Abbey last evening." Sir Reginald's uncomfortable silence provided its own answer. Poirot carefully replaced the documents, his expression thoughtful. "We begin to perceive the true dimensions of our puzzle. A locked room, an impossible flame, and a motive that strikes at the very heart of trust and betrayal. Edmund Thornfield chose that moment to saunter past the study door, pausing when he noticed our gathering. I say, Uncle did enjoy his little mysteries, didn't he? Though I must confess, this one seems rather more serious than his usual games." "Indeed, Monsieur Edmund. Tell me, when you departed through the French doors last evening, you mentioned encountering someone near the kitchen gardens." "Quite right." Moving rather furtively toward the servants' entrance, though the snow made identification difficult. Edmund's smile carried a hint of malice. "Of course, several of us had reason to move about discreetly last evening." After Edmund departed, Poirot turned his attention to a detailed examination of the study's physical evidence. The hearth contained only cold ashes, ruling out any papers burned in haste. The carpet showed no unusual impressions, and the desk drawers remained locked and undisturbed. "The window latch bears fresh scratches," Poirot observed, running his finger along the metal without touching. "Someone manipulated this mechanism recently, despite the room being locked from within." He straightened, his eyes bright with speculation. We have multiple impossibilities, mon ami. A candle that burns beyond natural limits, a room locked from within yet showing signs of external interference, and a murder committed without apparent means of entry or exit. Mrs. Pemberton arrived with afternoon tea, her movements still bearing the weight of grief. As she arranged the service, Poirot observed her with particular attention. Madame Pemberton, you mentioned hearing Sir Alistair muttering about trust and betrayal during your 11 o'clock rounds. Can you recall his exact words? He said something about years of faithful service meaning nothing when greed takes hold, she replied, her voice trembling, and that the guilty party would be exposed regardless of personal cost. I assumed he was referring to business matters. Most illuminating. And you are certain about the time you extinguished the candles? Absolutely certain, sir. 3 candles on his desk, all snuffed out just after 11. The master was still working, so I moved quietly around him. Mrs. Pemberton's composure cracked slightly. If only I'd known it would be our final conversation. The Reverend Timothy appeared in the hallway, his nervous energy more pronounced than ever. Monsieur Poirot, I feel compelled to mention something that may be relevant. I borrowed Mrs. Pemberton's candle snuffer yesterday to trim the wicks of my Advent candles, purple and rose wax for the Christmas service I had planned. Ah, the purple wax that found its way to Sir Alistair's window catch, most convenient for our investigation. Poirot's tone carried no accusation, merely interest. And you returned this snuffer when? I'm afraid I forgot in all the excitement. It's still in my room, along with the unused candles. The Reverend's face flushed with embarrassment. I realize how this must appear, but I assure you, peace, mon père. In cases such as these, every detail contributes to the final picture, regardless of how innocent or suspicious it may initially appear. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot gathered his observations with characteristic precision. The locked room mystery remained intact, but the foundation of deception was beginning to show cracks under the weight of accumulated evidence. We progress steadily toward the truth, he told me quietly as the others dispersed. Each examination reveals new contradictions, each interview exposes fresh impossibilities. The embezzlement provides powerful motive, the physical evidence suggests elaborate preparation, and the testimonies contain those small inconsistencies that mark the difference between truth and carefully rehearsed deception. He paused before the now cold candlestick, his expression thoughtful. Someone went to considerable trouble to create the impression of an impossible crime, mon ami. But impossibilities exist only in the realm of magic and superstition. In the world of murder, there are only clever preparations and careful misdirection. Soon, very soon, we shall see through both. The investigation was entering its most crucial phase, and I sensed that Poirot was beginning to perceive the true shape of the solution that continued to elude the rest of us. The grey light of Boxing Day morning brought with it Inspector Davies of the County Constabulary, a solid, methodical man whose arrival on the horseback through the treacherous, snow-laden roads spoke well of his determination. His weathered face bore the marks of long service in rural districts, and his manner suggested the practical skepticism of one who had seen enough of human nature to distrust elaborate theories. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Davies said after Lady Penelope had provided him with a thorough account of the previous evening's events, I've heard of your reputation, naturally. But I must say, this business strikes me as considerably less mysterious than it's been made to appear. Poirot received this observation with characteristic courtesy, though I detected the faintest tightening around his eyes. Indeed, Inspector, you have perhaps formed a theory. I have formed a conclusion, Davies replied with the confidence of long experience. We have a gentleman recently discovered to be the victim of systematic embezzlement, facing the prospect of financial ruin and public scandal. He locks himself in his study, takes poison, and that's the end of it. Tragic, certainly, but hardly mysterious. The word suicide fell among our assembled company like a stone cast into still water. Lady Penelope's face went ashen, while Sir Reginald's military bearing stiffened with indignation. Miss Crane clutched her notebook more tightly, and Edmund's expression remained carefully neutral. "Suicide?" Lady Penelope whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "Inspector, you cannot have known my brother. Alistair would never. He was a man of immense courage, even in adversity." Inspector Davies softened his tone with practiced sympathy. "I understand your feelings, my lady, but the evidence speaks clearly. The door was locked from within, the key in Sir Alistair's own hand. The windows remained latched and undisturbed. There was no possible means of entry or exit for any murderer." "And the candle, Inspector?" Poirot inquired gently. "A candle that burned throughout the night when all others had been extinguished." Davies waved a dismissive hand. "Candles burn at different rates, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps it was a particularly long-lasting variety, or a draught kept it alive. Such details, while curious, hardly negate the fundamental impossibility of murder under these circumstances." Poirot's response was to request that all members of the household surrender any medicines, tonics, or personal remedies in their possession. "For the sake of thoroughness, you understand. Inspector Davies may be correct, but let us eliminate all possibilities." The collection that assembled on Lady Penelope's writing desk told its own story of human frailty and careful maintenance. Miss Crane produced a neat tin of peppermint pastilles, explaining her throat troubles with the winter air. Sir Reginald contributed a silver case containing his customary cigars and a small bottle of digestive tablets. Edmund offered a flat silver flask of brandy with theatrical reluctance. The Reverend Timothy, his hands trembling slightly, provided a packet of aniseed lozenges for his persistent cough. Dr. Whitmore added a brown bottle of tonic and a small envelope of digitalis tablets intended for a patient. Lady Penelope herself contributed smelling salts and a delicate vial of lavender essence. Poirot examined each item with meticulous care, noting labels, testing scents with the briefest inhalation, and arranging everything with mathematical precision. Inspector Davies observed this process with barely concealed impatience. "You see, Monsieur Poirot," the inspector said, "any of these items could theoretically carry poison, but what does it matter? Sir Alistair was alone in a locked room. However the poison was administered, whether in food consumed earlier or medicine taken for some ailment, the fact remains that he died by his own hand in circumstances that made murder impossible." "Impossible," Poirot repeated thoughtfully, his fingers steepled before him. "That word, Inspector, it has always fascinated me, for what appears impossible to one mind may be merely improbable to another, and what seems improbable may be, in fact, inevitable." The Reverend Timothy, who had grown increasingly pale during this exchange, suddenly spoke. "If Sir Alistair did indeed take his own life, surely we should respect his final privacy and not subject his memory to further speculation?" "An admirable sentiment, mon père," Poirot replied, "but one that assumes the conclusion matches the evidence. Tell me, Inspector Davies, in your experience, do men who choose to end their lives typically lock doors with such ceremony? Do they arrange candles to burn as eternal flames? Do they clutch keys as if guarding secrets even in death?" Inspector Davies frowned, clearly uncomfortable with having his conclusions questioned. "People do strange things when facing their final moments, Monsieur Poirot. The mind, under such stress, may act in ways that seem theatrical or symbolic." "Precisely my point," Poirot said with sudden animation. "Theatrical, symbolic. These are the hallmarks not of despair, but of careful staging. Someone wished us to believe in suicide, Inspector, and they have succeeded admirably, with everyone save Hercule Poirot." I watched the faces of our assembled suspects as Poirot spoke, noting how each reacted to his rejection of the suicide theory. Miss Crane's relief was palpable, though she attempted to mask it behind professional composure. Edmund's carefully neutral expression flickered momentarily with what might have been annoyance or calculation. Sir Reginald nodded vigorously, clearly preferring the idea of murder to the shame of suicide. The Reverend Timothy's nervous energy seemed to increase, his hands plucking at his clerical collar with renewed agitation. "I propose a demonstration," Poirot announced, rising from his chair with characteristic precision. "This evening, after dinner, I shall show you exactly how a man may be murdered in a locked room, how a candle may be made to burn beyond its natural life, and how the impossible may be revealed as merely the improbable disguised by clever misdirection." Inspector Davies shook his head with patronizing tolerance. "I admire your confidence, Monsieur Poirot, but I'm afraid you're chasing shadows. The case is clear. Sir Alistair Blackwood took his own life in a moment of despair. No amount of theatrical demonstration will change that fundamental truth." "We shall see, Inspector. We shall see." Poirot's smile held no warmth, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who has perceived patterns invisible to others. "For while you may believe the case is solved, I assure you that the true murderer walks among us still, no doubt congratulating themselves on the success of their elaborate deception." As our gathering dispersed, I noticed how each person carried themselves differently. Some with relief, others with renewed anxiety, and one, I suspected, with the particular tension of a player whose opening gambit has succeeded, but who knows the game is far from over. The first false lead had been established and rejected, and Poirot's promise of a demonstration hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a hidden adversary. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and I could see in Poirot's bright, speculative eyes that his remarkable mind was already several moves ahead of everyone else in this deadly contest of wits. The evening meal at Thornfield Abbey passed in subdued conversation, the weight of Inspector Davies' suicide verdict hanging over our assembled company like a shroud. Yet I observed that Poirot consumed his roast beef with evident satisfaction, occasionally glancing about the table with those bright, speculative eyes that suggested his remarkable mind was working at full capacity. After dinner, as we gathered in the drawing-room for coffee, Poirot rose with characteristic precision and moved to the center of the room. "Mes amis," he announced, his voice carrying that particular authority that commanded immediate attention, "Inspector Davies has presented us with a most reasonable conclusion. Sir Alistair, facing financial ruin and public disgrace, took his own life in the privacy of his locked study. Logical, neat, and completely wrong." Inspector Davies shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Monsieur Poirot, I fail to see how you can dispute the physical evidence. The door was locked from within, the windows undisturbed." "Ah, but Inspector, you mistake the appearance of impossibility for impossibility itself. Tonight I shall demonstrate how a clever murderer created the illusion of suicide while committing the perfect crime." Poirot produced from his waistcoat pocket several small objects, a length of fishing line, a thin piece of curved metal, and what appeared to be a specially prepared candle. "First, the mystery of the eternal flame." He held up the candle, its surface bearing tiny, almost invisible perforations near the base. Madame Pemberton extinguished 3 candles at 11 o'clock, yet one burned throughout the night. How? Because this was not the same candle she extinguished. He demonstrated by inserting a fine wire through the candle's core. A candle prepared in advance, with its wick treated with oils to burn longer and more steadily than nature intended. The murderer simply replaced the extinguished candle with his prepared substitute. Miss Crane's teacup rattled against its saucer. But surely someone would have noticed the substitution. Would they, mademoiselle, in a room where a man lay dying, where panic and confusion reigned? The murderer had perhaps 10 minutes to complete their work while Sir Alistair succumbed to poison. Yes, Inspector, poison administered earlier in the evening through some trusted medium. Poirot moved to the study door, which had been left ajar for our demonstration. Now, the locked door mystery. Observe. He threaded the fishing line through the keyhole, attached it to the curved metal tool, and with practiced movements manipulated the key from the corridor side. The key turns, the door locks, and then he carefully withdrew the line, leaving the key dangling inside. A simple matter to position the key in the victim's hand, creating the perfect tableau of suicide. Sir Reginald's military bearing had stiffened with grudging admiration. Ingenious, but what about the windows? They were latched from within. Ah, the windows. Poirot produced a thin, flexible tool. The Reverend Timothy mentioned borrowing Madame Pemberton's candle snuffer for his Advent candles. Lovely purple wax, was it not? The same purple wax that Madame Pemberton found on the window catch and dutifully cleaned away. He demonstrated how the latch could be manipulated from outside, leaving only the faintest trace of wax. Entry and exit accomplished, evidence removed by the most conscientious housekeeper in England. The Reverend Timothy had grown increasingly pale during this demonstration, his nervous fingers plucking at his clerical collar. Edmund's carefully maintained composure showed hairline cracks, while Mrs. Pemberton watched with wounded eyes that suggested dawning comprehension. "But this is all theory," Inspector Davies protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You've shown us possibilities, not proof." "Have I not?" Poirot's smile held no warmth. "Then consider this. Our murderer possessed detailed knowledge of household routines, access to the necessary materials, and the technical skill to execute this elaborate deception. More significantly, they understood Sir Alistair's psychology well enough to predict his actions on Christmas Eve." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep over each face in turn. The embezzlement Sir Alistair discovered was not the work of a stranger, but of someone he trusted implicitly. Someone who knew that exposure meant not merely financial ruin, but the destruction of a carefully cultivated reputation. Someone who chose murder over disgrace and staged it as suicide to avoid suspicion. The tension in the room had become almost suffocating. Lady Penelope clutched her handkerchief with white knuckles, while Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with professional fascination. Most tellingly, Poirot continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "Our murderer could not resist adding theatrical touches to their crime. The eternal candle, the perfectly positioned key, the locked room mystery itself, all designed not merely to conceal guilt, but to showcase their cleverness." He straightened, smoothing his mustache with characteristic precision. "Tomorrow, when the road's clear, I shall present the authorities with a complete solution to this puzzle. Tonight I content myself with demonstrating that the impossible is merely the improbable disguised by human ingenuity and malice." As our gathering dispersed, I noticed how each person carried themselves differently, some with relief at having the suicide theory debunked, others with the particular tension of those who know their secrets are no longer safe. The psychological game had entered its most dangerous phase, and somewhere among us walked a murderer who now understood that their perfect crime was beginning to unravel. The gray dawn of the day after Boxing Day brought with it an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the ancient walls of Thornfield Abbey. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a landscape transformed into crystalline perfection, yet the beauty of the scene could not dispel the growing sense that our ordeal was far from over. I found Poirot in the morning room, already impeccably dressed despite the early hour, studying a small collection of items arranged with mathematical precision upon Lady Penelope's writing desk. His manner suggested the focused intensity of a chess master contemplating a particularly complex endgame. "The net tightens, mon ami," he observed, without looking up from his examination. "Our murderer grows increasingly desperate. Last night's demonstration has disturbed the careful equilibrium they worked so hard to establish. Soon, very soon, they will make the move that transforms suspicion into certainty." His prediction proved prophetic with shocking swiftness. At precisely 8 o'clock, as the household gathered for what we hoped might be our final breakfast at Thornfield Abbey, Mrs. Pemberton burst through the dining-room doors, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and terror written across her kindly features. "She's gone!" the housekeeper cried, her voice breaking with emotion. "Miss Crane, her room is empty, her bed unslept in, and her traveling case is missing." The announcement struck our assembled company like a physical blow. Lady Penelope rose so quickly that her chair toppled backward, while Sir Reginald's military composure cracked entirely. Inspector Davies, who had been preparing to depart for the county seat with his suicide verdict intact, immediately abandoned his plans. "When was she last seen?" the inspector demanded, his earlier certainty now seeming embarrassingly premature. "I brought her evening tea at 8:30. Mrs. Pemberton sobbed. She seemed terribly agitated, kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone, said she had urgent correspondence to complete before the roads cleared. Poirot's expression remained carefully neutral, though I detected the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in his bright eyes. "Her room, Inspector. We must examine it without delay." Miss Crane's chamber told the story of hasty but calculated departure. Her traveling case was indeed gone, along with her winter coat and sturdy walking boots. More significantly, her meticulous filing system had been ransacked, with papers scattered across her writing desk and several folders conspicuously absent. "The embezzlement documents," Sir Reginald breathed, examining the chaos with dawning comprehension. "She's taken everything related to the investigation." Inspector Davies' face had turned an alarming shade of red. "By God, we've been complete fools. The secretary. She had access to everything, knew all the household routines, could manipulate the financial records without suspicion." He turned to Poirot with grudging respect. "Your demonstration last night, it must have spooked her into running." "Perhaps," Poirot replied thoughtfully, though his tone suggested considerable reservation. He moved to the window, examining the latch with his magnifying glass. "Though I confess, Inspector, that Mademoiselle Crane's flight raises as many questions as it purports to answer." The search began immediately. Edmund and Sir Reginald took horses to patrol the main roads, while Dr. Whitmore organized the servants to scour the estate grounds. Within an hour, they discovered Miss Crane's abandoned motor car 2 miles from the Abbey, hopelessly stuck in a snowdrift with its engine long cold. Fresh footprints led toward the railway line that connected our district to London. "She's made for the early train," Inspector Davies concluded with renewed satisfaction. "But I've telegraphed ahead. The station master will detain her on my authority." Yet when the constables reached the station, they found only confusion and contradiction. A woman matching Miss Crane's description had indeed purchased a ticket to London, but according to multiple witnesses, she had boarded the train in the company of a tall gentleman whose face remained obscured by a heavy muffler and hat. "Most curious," Poirot observed when this intelligence reached us. "Mademoiselle Crane, fleeing alone in panic, suddenly acquires a mysterious traveling companion. How very theatrical." As the day progressed, a pattern emerged that troubled me deeply. Miss Crane's guilt appeared so obvious, so perfectly documented, that it struck me as almost too convenient. The embezzling secretary, caught by her employer's investigation, murders him to prevent exposure and stages the crime as suicide. When Poirot's demonstration threatens to expose her methods, she flees in panic, taking the incriminating evidence with her. "It fits beautifully," Inspector Davies declared with restored confidence. "Motive, means, opportunity, and now flight to confirm guilt beyond reasonable doubt." Yet I observed that Poirot received this conclusion with notable lack of enthusiasm. He spent the remainder of the morning in Sir Alister's study, examining and re-examining every detail with microscopic precision. The melted candle wax, the scratched window latch, the arrangement of papers, all received his methodical attention once more. "Something troubles you profoundly," I ventured as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. "Indeed, mon ami. Miss Crane's guilt appears so obvious, so perfectly documented, that it strikes me as almost choreographed, like a theatrical performance staged for our benefit." with every piece of evidence precisely placed to guide us toward the desired conclusion. He straightened, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. In my considerable experience, real criminals rarely flee so conveniently, leaving such a clear trail of breadcrumbs for the authorities to follow. They are far more likely to remain close by, maintaining their facade of innocence while secretly savoring their success. Lady Penelope appeared in the doorway at that moment, her face bearing the particular strain of someone who has endured too much uncertainty and contradiction. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of long reflection, "I must ask, are you truly certain that Miss Crane is our culprit? Something about her flight strikes me as fundamentally out of character. Victoria was many things. Efficient, sometimes cold, occasionally sharp-tongued. But she was never a coward. 15 years of faithful service do not suggest a woman who would run at the first sign of trouble." Poirot's smile held genuine warmth for perhaps the first time since our ordeal began. "Your instincts serve you admirably, madame. For I begin to suspect that Mademoiselle Crane's dramatic flight is not the conclusion of our mystery, but merely the opening movement of its final, most dangerous act." He moved to the window, gazing out at the pristine snow that had transformed the landscape into a deceptive portrait of peace and innocence. "Our true murderer remains among us, no doubt congratulating themselves on the success of their latest misdirection, but they have made one crucial error. They have underestimated the persistence of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells." As evening approached, I could sense the psychological pressure building like steam in a kettle. The apparent resolution of Miss Crane's guilt had satisfied Inspector Davies and seemingly closed the case. Yet Poirot's skepticism hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Somewhere among our remaining company walked a murderer who believed themselves safe behind their carefully constructed facade, unaware that their most dangerous opponent was only beginning to see through their elaborate deception. The true game, I realized with growing unease, was only now beginning in earnest. The pale winter evening settled over Thornfield Abbey with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the ancient stones like a living thing. Despite Inspector Davies' apparent satisfaction with Miss Crane's guilt and dramatic flight, I observed that Poirot moved through the house with the restless energy of a hound that has caught a scent invisible to lesser noses. "Mon ami," he said quietly as we stood in the great hall, his keen eyes studying the play of shadows cast by the Christmas tree's remaining candles. "Something troubles me profoundly about Mademoiselle Crane's convenient disappearance. In my considerable experience, guilty parties rarely flee with such theatrical precision, leaving behind exactly the evidence needed to confirm their culprit's status." His prediction proved prophetic with shocking swiftness. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the hallway, her face bearing fresh distress and her hands clutching a partially burned piece of paper. "Monsieur Poirot, I found this in Miss Crane's wastepaper basket, tucked beneath the kindling. I thought you should see it before the inspector departed for London." Poirot examined the document with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly grave. The paper bore the Blackwood family crest and a message written in Sir Alister's distinctive hand. "Victoria, come alone. 9:15, South Cloister, urgent, A.B." Yet something about the writing struck him as fundamentally wrong. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, holding the paper to the light. "The pressure is remarkably even throughout, lacking the natural variations of spontaneous writing. This signature has been traced, not written. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to forge Sir Alister's hand." The implications were staggering. If the note was forged, then Miss Crane had been deliberately lured away, not fleeing in panic but responding to what she believed was her employer's urgent summons. Poirot's expression hardened with determination. "Inspector Davies," he called sharply, "we must search the Abbey grounds immediately. I fear Mademoiselle Crane has not fled but has become another victim of our murderer's elaborate deception." The search began at once, focusing on the South Cloister mentioned in the forged note. The ancient stone walkway showed signs of recent disturbance in the snow, and at the small door leading to the old ice house, Poirot paused with the intensity of a pointer sensing game. "Help me," he commanded, and together we lifted the heavy bolt. The door protested on frozen hinges, releasing air cold as the grave itself. My lantern threw a trembling circle of light over stone steps slick with ice, and at the bottom, huddled beneath a horse blanket and bound at the wrists with precisely tied cord, lay Miss Victoria Crane. She stirred when the light reached her face, her usual efficiency replaced by the disorientation of someone emerging from drugged unconsciousness. Poirot knelt beside her with characteristic gentleness, his hands quick but careful as he examined her bonds. "Courage, mademoiselle," he said softly. "You are among friends now." Her first words came as a whisper scraped raw by cold and fear. "I didn't run," she managed, her eyes struggling to focus. "Sir Alister's note. I was to bring the files," he requested. But when I reached the cloister, there was someone waiting, a handkerchief pressed to my face. It smelled of lavender and something medicinal, sweet like aniseed lozenges. Then darkness. Poirot's examination of her restraints revealed the methodical precision that had characterized every aspect of this crime. The knots were tidy and compact, their ends trimmed with the particular care of someone who valued order above all else. More significantly, Miss Crane's traveling case and winter coat had been taken, along with her motorcar keys, all part of the elaborate staging of her apparent flight. "The theatrical elements multiply," Poirot observed as we helped Miss Crane to the warmth of the chapel. A forged note, a carefully staged kidnapping, and the systematic removal of evidence to support the fiction of guilt and flight. Someone has orchestrated this deception with remarkable attention to detail. When we returned to the house with our rescued victim, the assembled company reacted with varying degrees of shock and relief. Lady Penelope's genuine distress at Miss Crane's ordeal seemed beyond question, while Sir Reginald's military composure cracked with what appeared to be authentic emotion. Edmund's carefully maintained neutrality flickered momentarily, and the Reverend Timothy's nervous energy intensified as he clutched his prayer book with trembling hands. Dr. Whitmore's examination confirmed mild exposure and the effects of some form of sedative, though Miss Crane's mental faculties remained sharp. As Mrs. Pemberton prepared restorative tea, Poirot took the opportunity to examine Miss Crane's abandoned office more thoroughly. The filing cabinet was ransacked, he noted, studying the scattered papers with methodical precision. "But observe, only certain documents are missing. The embezzlement evidence remains, but Sir Alister's private correspondence has vanished, along with his appointment diary for the past month." He produced his camera and photographed the study from multiple angles, paying particular attention to the arrangement of objects on Sir Alister's desk. 3 candles were extinguished by Madame Pemberton, yet we found only one burning. The question becomes, why replace only one candle with the prepared substitute? Why not maintain the original arrangement? The answer, when it came, revealed the true sophistication of the murder method. Poirot's examination of the desk surface with his magnifying glass revealed faint indentations beside the empty candlestick, marks left by some small, heavy object that had been removed after the crime. "The murderer required a specific arrangement," Poirot explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. The single burning candle was not merely misdirection, it was essential to concealing the true mechanism of Sir Alister's death. Something was positioned beside the original candle, something that required precise timing and careful removal after the crime was completed. As evening deepened, a second attempt was made to eliminate potential witnesses. Sir Reginald, accepting what he believed to be harmless tea service, suddenly stiffened and clutched his chest. Dr. Whitmore's immediate intervention with cardiac stimulants prevented serious harm, but the message was clear. Someone was systematically removing anyone who might contradict their carefully constructed narrative. The pattern emerges with crystalline clarity, Poirot announced as our shaken company gathered in the drawing room. First, the embezzlement is discovered, providing motive for murder. Then Sir Alistair is killed in circumstances designed to suggest suicide. When that fails to satisfy, Miss Crane is framed through elaborate staging. When her innocence is established, attempts are made to silence potential witnesses. He paused, his keen gaze sweeping over each face in turn. Our murderer possesses intimate knowledge of household routines, access to the necessary materials, and the technical skill to execute these elaborate deceptions. More significantly, they understand each person's psychology well enough to predict and manipulate their actions. The little Belgian detective straightened, smoothing his mustache with characteristic precision. Tomorrow morning, I shall gather all who remain at Thornfield Abbey for my final exposition. The time has come to strip away the theatrical elements and reveal the truth that lies beneath this carefully constructed facade of impossibility and misdirection. As our gathering dispersed, I could sense the psychological pressure building toward its inevitable climax. The systematic elimination of suspects through flight, kidnapping, and attempted poisoning had been revealed as elaborate misdirection, but somewhere among us walked a murderer who now understood that their perfect crime was beginning to unravel under the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's remarkable mind. The final act of our Christmas mystery was about to begin, and I suspected that the revelation, when it came, would prove as shocking as it was inevitable. The pale winter morning of December the 28th brought with it a crystalline clarity that seemed to strip away all illusions, leaving only truth exposed beneath the harsh light. The rescue of Miss Crane had shattered Inspector Davies's comfortable suicide theory, and now the remaining members of our company moved through Thornfield Abbey with the particular tension of those who know their secrets are no longer safe. Poirot had risen before dawn, conducting what he termed his final examination with the methodical precision of a master craftsman putting finishing touches to his work. When I joined him in Sir Alistair's study, I found him bent over the mahogany desk with his magnifying glass, studying the leather blotter with intense concentration. "Observe, mon ami," he said without looking up, producing a sheet of thin paper and a pencil. He shaded carefully across the blotter's surface, and like a photograph emerging from developer, indented words rose to visibility. The diary entry we all observed, 11:40 p.m., Ashworth. Final decision reached. It tells us a most interesting story. The impressions revealed the natural rhythm and pressure variations of Sir Alistair's earlier entries, but the final damning line showed none of these characteristics. This entry was made with a guard sheet beneath, Poirot explained, or after the blotter was repositioned. Our murderer added this theatrical touch to implicate Sir Reginald, but they forgot that paper remembers what the eye cannot see. He straightened, moving to examine the window latch once more. The tiny scratches remained visible, along with microscopic traces of the purple wax that Mrs. Pemberton had so conscientiously cleaned away. The Reverend Timothy's borrowed candle snuffer and Advent candles provided the perfect tools for this deception, Poirot observed. Purple wax, transferred during the manipulation of this latch from outside. Our morning gathering in the Great Hall revealed the psychological toll of the prolonged investigation. Lady Penelope maintained her dignified composure, though I detected a brittleness beneath her refined manner. Sir Reginald's military bearing remained intact, but his eyes held the wariness of a veteran who senses an ambush. Edmund lounged with studied casualness that failed to mask his underlying tension. The Reverend Timothy clutched his prayer book with hands that trembled more noticeably each day, while Miss Crane, though recovered from her ordeal, watched everyone with the sharp attention of someone who had glimpsed their own mortality. "Today," Poirot announced to our assembled company, "we shall conduct one final experiment. I require each person to demonstrate their handwriting once more, but this time under slightly different circumstances." He produced several sheets of Thornfield Abbey stationery and Sir Alistair's own fountain pen. Please write the following phrase. The final decision has been reached regarding the embezzlement matter. As each person wrote, Poirot observed not merely their script but their breathing, their posture, the pressure they applied to the pen. Lady Penelope's writing flowed with practiced elegance. Sir Reginald's hand produced the solid, angular letters of a military man. Edmund's script showed the impatience of someone accustomed to quick signatures on dubious documents. The Reverend Timothy's writing betrayed his nervousness in every trembling loop. Miss Crane, despite her recent trauma, produced her characteristic neat efficiency. Merci beaucoup, Poirot said, collecting the papers with ceremonial care. These samples, combined with the evidence from the blotter, will provide the final piece of our puzzle. He then requested Mrs. Pemberton's assistance in recreating the exact conditions of Christmas Eve. The housekeeper, grateful for tasks that distracted from grief, helped arrange 3 candles on Sir Alister's desk precisely as they had been positioned that fatal night. Poirot examined each candlestick with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the brass fittings and any traces of foreign substances. The eternal candle presents us with our most ingenious clue, he explained, producing what appeared to be an ordinary beeswax candle. Upon closer examination, however, tiny perforations near the base became visible, along with a faint sheen of oil that would cause it to burn longer and more steadily than nature intended. This prepared candle was substituted after Mrs. Pemberton completed her rounds, creating the illusion of supernatural persistence. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot made his final preparations. He examined the small brass mechanism he had discovered hidden beneath the false disc on Sir Alister's desk, a cunning device no larger than a pocket watch, designed to release its contents at a predetermined time when activated by heat from a nearby flame. The murderer's greatest mistake, he told me quietly as we stood in the study where it all began, was their inability to resist theatrical flourishes. The locked room, the eternal flame, the perfectly positioned evidence, all designed not merely to conceal guilt, but to demonstrate their superiority over ordinary minds. Tomorrow morning, I shall show them that no human intelligence, however clever, can long withstand the persistent application of method and logic. He smoothed his mustache with characteristic precision, his bright eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a puzzle nearly solved. The psychological pressure has reached its breaking point, mon ami. Our murderer knows that their elaborate deception is crumbling, and desperate people make desperate choices. Tonight, we must be particularly vigilant, for cornered animals are at their most dangerous. As evening approached, the atmosphere at Thornfield Abbey grew increasingly oppressive. Each member of our company carried themselves with the particular tension of those who know that tomorrow will bring either vindication or exposure. Somewhere among us walked a murderer who had orchestrated one of the most ingenious crimes ever conceived, yet who now faced the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's remarkable mind. The final act was about to begin, and I sensed that the revelation, when it came, would prove as shocking as it was inevitable. The pale winter morning of December 29th brought with it an air of finality that seemed to permeate every stone of Thornfield Abbey. Our remaining company assembled in the great hall, with the particular tension of those who know that secrets long hidden are about to be dragged into the unforgiving light of truth. Poirot had arranged the chairs with mathematical precision, each positioned to afford an unobstructed view of what would prove to be his most remarkable demonstration. "Mes amis," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "we have before us a crime of exceptional ingenuity, a murder disguised as suicide, executed within circumstances that appeared impossible, and staged with such theatrical precision that even experienced investigators were completely deceived." He rose from his chair with characteristic grace, moving to stand before the great fireplace where the morning light illuminated his distinctive silhouette. Sir Alister Blackwood was murdered by someone who understood not merely his habits and routines, but his very psychology. Someone who possessed the technical knowledge to create an elaborate mechanism, the dramatic sensibility to stage an impossible crime, and the desperate motive to risk everything on a single, perfect deception. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot produced the small brass device he had discovered beneath Sir Alister's desk, a mechanism no larger than a pocket watch, its surface bearing the patina of careful craftsmanship. This ingenious contraption, activated by sustained heat from a specially prepared candle, released a measured dose of concentrated digitalis vapor directly into the study's atmosphere. The timing was precise, exactly 47 minutes after the candle reached sufficient temperature to trigger the spring-loaded mechanism. Inspector Davies leaned forward with professional interest. But how could anyone position such a device in a locked room? Ah, Inspector, the murderer required no dramatic entry because they possessed something far more valuable, intimate knowledge of Sir Alister's unvarying Christmas Eve ritual. The device was positioned during the afternoon, concealed beneath a false compartment in the desk, waiting for the inevitable sequence, the evening brandy, the single candle lit for reading, the door locked for privacy. Poirot's keen gaze swept over the assembled faces, noting every expression, every nervous gesture. The eternal candle that so mystified us was the key to the entire deception. Mrs. Pemberton extinguished 3 candles at 11 o'clock, yet one burned throughout the night. This was not the same candle she had snuffed, but a specially prepared substitute. Its wick treated with oils, its base perforated to burn longer and steadier than nature intended. He moved to examine the handwriting samples collected the previous day, holding each sheet to the light with methodical precision. The forged diary entry implicating Sir Reginald, the false note that lured Miss Crane to her imprisonment, the systematic removal of evidence, all executed with the same attention to theatrical detail that characterized the original crime. The tension in the room had become almost suffocating as Poirot continued his inexorable revelation. The purple wax found on the window latch came from Advent candles borrowed from the chapel, used not for religious purposes, but to manipulate the casement from outside, creating the illusion of external entry while the room remained locked from within. Edmund Thornfield's carefully maintained composure showed the first hairline cracks as Poirot's analysis continued. The embezzlement investigation would have exposed systematic theft from the family trust, funds diverted to support gambling debts and questionable investments. Sir Alister's discovery meant not merely financial ruin, but the complete destruction of carefully cultivated prospects. "You speak of evidence, Monsieur Poirot," Edmund said with studied casualness, "but surely circumstantial observations hardly constitute proof." "On the contrary, Monsieur Edmund, the evidence is overwhelming when viewed as a complete pattern." Poirot's voice carried the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. The London clockmaker whose card you carry confirmed supplying a special mechanism for a gentleman's scientific experiment. The knots binding Miss Crane bore the distinctive characteristics of hunting field techniques you learned in your youth. Most tellingly, your penknife retains traces of purple wax and the faint scent of lavender essence, evidence of your manipulation of both window latch and the handkerchief used to subdue Miss Crane. Edmund's facade cracked entirely, his handsome features twisting with a mixture of rage and grudging admiration. "He would have destroyed me," he said, his voice carrying the particular bitterness of a gambler who has lost everything on a single throw. 20 years of exile, and he summoned me home only to parade my disgrace before the family. I gave him a more dignified exit than he deserved." Inspector Davies stepped forward with professional efficiency, the handcuffs already prepared. "Edmund Thornfield, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Alister Blackwood and the kidnapping of Miss Victoria Crane." As they led him away, Edmund's final words carried the theatrical flourish that had characterized every aspect of his elaborate crime. "I would have succeeded, you know, if not for your insufferable persistence in questioning the obvious." Poirot stood by the great Christmas tree, its remaining ornaments catching the pale winter light. "The candle that refused to go out," he murmured softly. "It was intended as a symbol of eternal mystery. Instead, it became the instrument of justice. For truth, like that stubborn flame, has a way of refusing to be extinguished, no matter how clever the deception designed to snuff it out." Justice had been served, though the cost in human terms remained staggering. A family destroyed by greed, trust shattered by betrayal, and the ancient walls of Thornfield Abbey, forever marked by the memory of Christmas, turned to tragedy. The pale afternoon light filtering through Thornfield Abbey's ancient windows seemed to carry with it a sense of finality as our remaining company absorbed the full implications of Edmund Thornfield's dramatic confession and arrest. Inspector Davies, his professional pride restored through association with Poirot's remarkable deduction, efficiently coordinated the formal procedures while maintaining the respectful demeanor of one who had learned humility through experience. The technical resolution, Dr. Whitmore's subsequent examination of the murder mechanism, revealed the full extent of Edmund's diabolical ingenuity. The brass device, no larger than a gentleman's pocket watch, contained a sealed glass ampule of concentrated digitalis solution, positioned behind a delicate bimetal strip. When the specially prepared candle burned long enough to generate sustained heat, the strip would bend gradually until a spring mechanism released, cracking the ampule and allowing the deadly vapor to rise invisibly into the study's confined atmosphere. The timing required precise calculation, Dr. Whitmore observed, with professional fascination tinged by horror. Room temperature, air circulation, the victim's respiratory rate. Edmund's university studies in chemistry and mechanical engineering served him well in this monstrous application. Poirot nodded gravely. Sir Alister's unvarying Christmas Eve routine provided the psychological certainty Edmund required. Every year, without fail, he would retire to his study at exactly 10 minutes past 11, light a single candle, and spend precisely 1 hour reviewing his financial ledgers. Edmund could set his timing with absolute confidence, knowing his uncle's habits as intimately as his own. The deeper motivations. As the investigation's final details emerged, the true scope of Edmund's desperation became clear. The embezzlement had grown far beyond the initially discovered £10,000. Nearly 30,000 had been systematically diverted over 2 years to support not merely gambling debts, but a secret marriage and growing family that Edmund had concealed from the entire Blackwood clan. The inheritance clauses, Miss Crane explained with professional precision, her composure fully restored despite her recent ordeal, specifically excluded any heir who married without family consent. Sir Alister had discovered not only the theft, but Edmund's clandestine domestic arrangements. Complete disinheritance was inevitable. Lady Penelope, maintaining her dignity despite the family disgrace, approached this revelation with characteristic grace. "To think that Edmund felt he could not trust us with the truth of his marriage," she said quietly. "We might have found a way to preserve both his happiness and his honor, had he possessed the courage for honesty rather than deception." Character resolutions. Miss Victoria Crane returned to her duties with a new steadiness that spoke of private tests met and passed. Poirot, with characteristic tact, ensured that the forged summons and her imprisonment remained excluded from public gossip. "A woman who has been made a pawn," he observed to me privately, "should not be forced to live forever on the chessboard." Sir Reginald Ashworth, his military bearing fully restored now that suspicion had lifted from his shoulders, worked with Lady Penelope to establish a trust that would restore the embezzled funds without dismissing loyal servants. The partnership that had survived Sir Alister's death would honor his memory through continued integrity. The Reverend Timothy, his nervous energy finally subsiding, found peace in the knowledge that his innocent preparations for Christmas service had been manipulated by a master deceiver. He later wrote that his sermon on Epiphany Sunday spoke of lights meant to illuminate truth rather than conceal it, drawing considerable comfort from the congregation's understanding response. Mrs. Pemberton, her grief tempered by relief that the household's reputation remained intact, resumed her duties with renewed purpose. "It seems impossible," she confided to Poirot, "that someone could plan such elaborate evil while appearing so reasonable and charming. Master Edmund was always the family favorite before his troubles began." The final accounting. Edmund's confession, extracted through confrontation with irrefutable evidence, revealed the full extent of his psychological manipulation. The forged diary entries, the theatrical staging of impossible circumstances, the systematic elimination of witnesses, all demonstrated a mind that viewed other human beings as pieces in an elaborate game rather than fellow creatures deserving of basic consideration. His greatest strength became his fatal weakness, Poirot observed as we prepared for departure. The theatrical sensibility that made his deception so elaborate also made it ultimately detectable. A simpler crime might have succeeded where this masterpiece of misdirection failed. The irony was not lost on any of us that Edmund's elaborate scheme had been entirely unnecessary. Had he confessed his embezzlement and thrown himself upon Sir Alister's mercy, family loyalty might have provided solutions that preserved both his freedom and his life. Instead, pride and desperation had driven him to create what he believed was the perfect crime, only to discover that no human intelligence, however clever, can long withstand the persistent application of method and logic. Philosophical Reflections. As our motor car navigated the snow-covered drive away from Thornfield Abbey, the Christmas decorations still visible through frost-etched windows seemed to mock the tragedy that had unfolded beneath their festive presence. The great tree's ornaments caught the pale winter sunlight with subdued brilliance, while holly and ivy maintained their seasonal promise despite the shadow of recent events. "The candle that refused to go out," Poirot murmured as the Abbey's towers disappeared behind winter-bare trees, "was intended as a symbol of eternal mystery. Instead, it became the instrument of justice itself, proof that truth, like light, has an irrepressible tendency to illuminate even the darkest corners of human deception." I reflected on the week's extraordinary events as we traveled toward London and the promise of new mysteries yet to be solved. The Christmas case that had begun with an impossible locked room had revealed itself as a testament to both human ingenuity and human corruption, a reminder that the most monstrous evil can reside within the most familiar and charming of countenances. "Another case closed, Poirot," I observed, though the words carried less satisfaction than usual. "Indeed, mon ami. Yet this particular investigation will remain memorable not for its complexity, but for its demonstration that evil, though often clever, cannot long withstand the patient persistence of goodness. For truth, like that stubborn flame, refuses to be extinguished, no matter how elaborate the deception designed to snuff it out." The road ahead stretched clear and bright beneath the winter sun, leading us away from tragedy and toward the eternal promise that justice, however delayed, will ultimately prevail over even the most ingenious attempts to subvert it. Epilogue. Edmund Thornfield was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment, his elaborate crime serving as a cautionary tale about the corruption of intelligence by desperation and pride. The Blackwood estate, after necessary legal proceedings, passed to Lady Penelope, who administered it with the same grace and integrity that had sustained her through the family's darkest hour. The murder mechanism, preserved as evidence, became a subject of study at Scotland Yard, where it served as a reminder that criminal ingenuity, however sophisticated, cannot ultimately triumph over methodical investigation and unwavering dedication to truth. The candle that had burned through that fateful Christmas night was never lit again, but its memory served as an eternal flame for justice, a light that refuses to be extinguished by even the cleverest attempts at deception. The immediate aftermath of Edmund Thornfield's arrest settled over Thornfield Abbey with that particular silence that follows the resolution of long-held tension. Lady Penelope maintained her composure with characteristic grace, though I observed the slight tremor in her hands as she directed Mrs. Pemberton to prepare refreshments for our departure. The remaining members of our company moved with subdued dignity, each processing the revelation that the charming nephew they had welcomed back into the family circle had repaid their trust with the most monstrous betrayal imaginable. Inspector Davies approached Poirot with profound respect, his earlier certainty about suicide now seeming embarrassingly premature. "Monsieur Poirot, I must admit I had misjudged the situation entirely. Without your persistence, a dangerous criminal would have walked free, and an innocent man's memory would have been forever tainted by the stigma of self-destruction." Miss Crane, though still pale from her ordeal in the ice-house, displayed remarkable resilience as she methodically began reorganizing Sir Alister's study. Her systematic nature found solace in restoring order to the chaos that Edmund's elaborate deception had created. Yet I noted a new depth in her eyes that suggested a quiet understanding of life's darker currents. The journey to understanding. The train journey back to London provided ample opportunity for reflection upon the extraordinary events we had witnessed. Poirot sat opposite me in our first-class compartment, his egg-shaped head tilted thoughtfully as he watched the winter countryside roll past our frost-etched windows. "The tragedy of Edmund Thornfield," he observed without turning from his contemplation, "was not his lack of ability, but his inability to accept the consequences of his earlier choices. The gambling debts, the secret marriage, the systematic embezzlement, each represented a decision to take the easy path rather than face difficult truths." I reflected upon the nephew who had possessed every advantage of birth, education, and natural charm, yet had chosen to construct an elaborate monument to his own cleverness built upon his uncle's grave. "The waste of it all troubles me, Poirot. He could have made something worthwhile of his life." "Precisely the point, mon ami. Edmund's psychology demanded theatrical staging. A simple poisoning would have satisfied the requirements of murder, but would not have demonstrated his intellectual superiority. The locked room, the eternal flame, the impossible circumstances, all designed not merely to conceal guilt, but to showcase his cleverness to an audience he believed incapable of appreciating his artistry. The technical aspects of the crime had indeed been remarkable. The timing mechanism that delivered death with precision while providing an unshakable alibi, the prepared candle that burned beyond natural limits, the psychological manipulation of household routines, all demonstrated considerable ingenuity twisted to monstrous purpose. Letters and lasting resolutions. In the weeks that followed our return to London, correspondence from Thornfield Abbey revealed the long-term consequences of our Christmas investigation. Lady Penelope's first letter, written in that composed hand which never allowed emotion to disorder clarity, thanked Poirot with genuine gratitude and reported that Miss Crane had accepted her request to remain not as a mere secretary, but as a valued colleague and guardian of order. Sir Reginald established a scholarship in Sir Alister's name for apprentices in honest trade. Young men with clever hands, but no taste for tricks, as he put it. The Reverend Timothy's Epiphany sermon, sent to us in print, spoke of lights meant to illuminate truth rather than conceal it, concluding with a line that would have pleased Poirot. "Light is most itself when it needs no dramatics to be seen." Most touching was Lady Penelope's quiet arrangement of an allowance for the young, woman and child whom Edmund had hidden from his family's gaze. "We will not visit the sins of the father upon the innocent," she wrote simply, demonstrating the grace that had sustained her through the family's darkest hour. Inspector Davies called upon us at Whitehaven Mansions one damp afternoon, humility made almost jaunty by relief. "Your method has altered my view of impossibility, Monsieur Poirot. We shall be more careful of what we call final." Poirot showed him the little brass mechanism, now defanged and catalogued among his curiosities, discoursing upon the moral difference between ingenuity and wisdom. The eternal flame of truth. As we settled into our familiar routine of London life, Poirot placed the candlestick from Sir Alister's desk beside his collection of criminal curiosities. A bogus Egyptian scarab, a counterfeit cameo, and a gold pencil that had once disguised a fountain pen syringe. "The instruments differ," he observed, "but the motif remains constant. Concealment, mon ami, yet a true flame needs no dramatics to be seen. Edmund's candle that refused to go out was intended as his masterpiece, a symbol of eternal mystery. Instead, it became the instrument of his exposure, proof that truth, like light itself, cannot be permanently extinguished by even the most elaborate attempts at deception." The telephone rang, announcing another case, another mystery requiring the attention of his remarkable mind. As we prepared to step out into the London night, Poirot gave the candlestick a gentle tap, as one might congratulate a pupil who has survived a difficult examination. "Order and method, Hastings," he said softly, smoothing his mustache with characteristic precision. "The candle that burned through that fateful Christmas night will never be lit again, but its memory serves as an eternal flame for justice. A reminder that truth, however cleverly concealed, will ultimately triumph over the most elaborate deceptions that human ingenuity can devise." The case was closed, but the lesson endured. That evil, though often clever, cannot long withstand the patient persistence of goodness, and that justice, like that stubborn flame, refuses to be extinguished by even the most ingenious attempts to snuff it out.